The sound of shuffling feet echoed through the abandoned supermarket as Kestrel pressed her back against the cold metal shelving, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. 3 months had passed since the world had collapsed into chaos, since the dead had risen to reclaim the earth from the living, and still she couldn't get used to that distinctive dragging sound they made. It was the sound of decay in motion, of humanity's final chapter being written in blood and rotting flesh. She peered around the corner of the cereal aisle, her trained nurses' eyes quickly assessing the threat. 2 of them wandered aimlessly near the pharmacy section, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes controlled by a drunk puppeteer. Their clothes hung in tatters, stained with substances Kestrel preferred not to identify, and their skin had taken on that telltale grayish pallor that meant they'd been gone for weeks, maybe months. The weight of the backpack on her shoulders reminded her why she was here. Antibiotics. Painkillers. Anything that could help Zephyr fight off the infection that was slowly claiming his leg. The 17-year-old had been her constant companion since they'd found each other in the ruins of downtown Portland, his knowledge of electronics and hacking proving invaluable in a world where information meant survival. But a rusty nail 3 days ago had torn through his jeans and deep into his calf, and despite her medical training, Kestrel knew they needed more than improvised first aid. A soft whistle from the front of the store made her freeze. It was Caspian's signal, the one that meant trouble was coming from the outside. The former Marine had insisted on standing guard while she and the others scavenged, his military bearing and tactical knowledge having saved their small group more times than she could count. His weathered face and steel-gray eyes spoke of battles fought long before the dead had risen, but there was a gentleness to him when he thought no one was looking, especially when he spoke to little Vega. Kestrel made her decision quickly, grabbing bottles of medication from behind the shattered pharmacy counter and stuffing them into her pack. The 2 zombies turned at the sound of glass crunching under her boots, their clouded eyes fixing on her with the singular hunger that drove them. She backed toward the rear exit, her hand instinctively moving to the knife at her belt. She'd learned early in this new world that guns drew too much attention, that silence was often the difference between living another day and becoming another shambling nightmare. The back door burst open just as the first zombie reached for her, and Ronan's broad frame filled the doorway. The mechanic's oil-stained hands gripped a tire iron, and his usually jovial expression was grim with urgency. "We've got company coming," he said, his Irish accent thickened by stress. "Whole pack of them, maybe 30 or 40, moving up from the river." Behind him, Indira appeared like a shadow, her dark eyes scanning the pharmacy with the same methodical precision she'd once used to catalog plant species. The botanist rarely spoke, but when she did, everyone listened. "The winds changed direction," she said quietly. "They caught our scent from the camp." Kestrel's stomach dropped. Their temporary shelter was a mile away, hidden in the basement of an old office building. Zephyr was there alone, weak and feverish, unable to run if the Horde found him. She pushed past the zombies, who were still stumbling toward them with increasing agitation, and followed Ronan and Indira into the gray afternoon light. The sky was the color of old concrete, heavy with the promise of rain that would make everything harder. Rain meant reduced visibility, slippery surfaces, and the awful sounds of the undead muffled until they were almost on top of you. But it also meant their scent would be washed away, giving them a chance to disappear if they moved quickly enough. Caspian was already moving toward them, little Vega's hand clutched tightly in his own. The 8-year-old girl they'd rescued from an Overrun elementary school 2 weeks ago had barely spoken since they'd found her hiding in a supply closet, surrounded by the remains of her classmates and teacher. Her wide, dark eyes held a depth of trauma that made Kestrel's heart ache, but there was also a resilience there that reminded her why they kept fighting. "How long do we have?" Kestrel asked as they regrouped. Caspian checked his watch, a habit from his military days that he'd never broken. "Maybe 20 minutes before they reach the building. We can get there first, grab Zephyr and whatever supplies we can carry, but we'll have to move fast and light." The group fell into the practiced rhythm of people who had learned to survive together. No arguments, no wasted words, just the grim efficiency of those who understood that hesitation meant death. As they jogged through the empty streets, stepping carefully around abandoned cars and debris, Kestrel couldn't shake the feeling that this time was different. This time, their luck might finally run out. The stairwell of the office building reeked of mold and something else, something sweet and cloying that made Kestrel's stomach turn. Death had a smell that lingered, seeping into concrete and steel like a stain that couldn't be scrubbed away. Their footsteps echoed despite their attempts at stealth, each sound seeming to announce their presence to anything that might be listening in the darkness below. Zephyr was exactly where they'd left him, propped against a wall in the basement storage room they'd converted into their temporary sanctuary. His laptop was open beside him, its screen casting an eerie blue glow across his pale features. Despite the fever that had been burning through him for 2 days, he'd managed to maintain the security cameras he'd jury-rigged throughout the building, their wireless feeds creating a makeshift early warning system that had saved them countless times. "You look like hell," Ronan said with forced cheer as he knelt beside the teenager, but Kestrel could see the worry in the mechanic's eyes. Zephyr's leg was worse, the angry red streaks of infection creeping up from the wound site like poisonous ivy. The antibiotics she'd retrieved might help, but they were fighting against time and her own limitations as a medic. "Feel like it too," Zephyr managed, his voice hoarse. "But I've got good news and bad news. Good news is I've been monitoring emergency frequencies. There's a settlement about 50 miles north, near Mount Hood. They're calling themselves Haven, and they claim to have medical facilities and sustainable food production." Indira looked up from where she was carefully selecting seeds and plant cuttings from her collection, each one representing hope for a future where humanity might grow its own food again. "And the bad news?" Zephyr's fingers moved weakly across his keyboard, bringing up a map dotted with red markers. "The bad news is that every major route between here and there is crawling with the dead. The highways are completely blocked. Whatever drove that horde toward us, it's part of something bigger. The whole region is on the move." Caspian studied the map with the tactical mind that had kept him alive through 3 tours overseas and now this nightmare at home. "We'll have to go around, through the mountains. It'll take longer, and winter's coming, but it's our best shot." "What about transport?" Kestrel asked as she opened her medical kit and began preparing the antibiotics. "We can't carry everything we need for a 50-mile journey through mountain terrain." Ronan's face lit up with the first genuine smile she'd seen from him in days. "That's where the good news comes in. I found something yesterday while you were all searching the residential district. There's a garage about 6 blocks from here, and they've got an old military transport truck. Army surplus, probably from the National Guard depot. It's built to handle rough terrain, and if I can get it running, it'll carry all of us plus supplies." The sound of distant moaning drifted down through the building's ventilation system, a low chorus that raised the hair on the back of Kestrel's neck. The horde was getting closer, their hunger driving them forward with relentless determination. She injected the antibiotic into Zephyr's arm, noting how hot his skin felt beneath her fingers. Vega, who had been sitting silently in the corner with a battered picture book, suddenly looked up and pointed toward the ceiling. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was barely above a whisper. "They're in the building." Everyone froze, straining to listen. Above them, the unmistakable sound of shuffling feet echoed through the floors, accompanied by the occasional thud of bodies bumping into walls and furniture. Somehow, despite their precautions, the dead had found their way inside. Caspian was already moving, checking his weapon and signaling for silence. "How many cameras do you have active?" he whispered to Zephyr. The teenager's fingers flew across his keyboard despite his weakness. "For main feeds, plus motion sensors on the stairwells." His face paled even further as he studied the screens. "Jesus. There are dozens of them, maybe more. They're spread throughout the upper floors, and more are coming in through the lobby." Indira was already packing her most essential seeds into a waterproof pouch, her movements economical and precise. Years of field research had taught her to prioritize and move quickly when nature turned hostile. "The service tunnel," she said quietly. I mapped the building's infrastructure when we first arrived. There's a maintenance tunnel that connects to the parking garage next door. Kestrel helped Zephyr to his feet, feeling how much weight he'd lost in just a few days. The infection was winning, and they all knew it, though no one would say it aloud. Can you walk? I'll have to, he replied, closing his laptop and sliding it into his backpack. The cameras will keep recording for another hour before the batteries die. Maybe that'll buy us some time to see what's following us. Ronan had already located the service access panel Indira had mentioned, his mechanical knowledge making quick work of the locks. The tunnel beyond was narrow and dark, barely wide enough for them to move single file. The air was stale and filled with the smell of rust and decay, but it was better than facing the growing horde above. As they prepared to enter the tunnel, Kestrel took one last look around the space that had been their home for the past week. Their sleeping bags were neatly arranged in one corner, Vega's few toys carefully placed beside them. A small camping stove sat next to their dwindling food supplies, and Indira's improvised garden occupied a patch of floor near a crack in the foundation that let in a thin stream of natural light. It wasn't much, but it had been theirs. In a world where safety was an illusion and home was wherever you could sleep without fear, losing even this small sanctuary felt like another death. The sound of footsteps on the stairs grew louder, accompanied by the wet, guttural sounds the dead made when they caught the scent of living flesh. "Time to go," Caspian said, and one by one, they disappeared into the darkness of the tunnel, leaving behind another piece of their former lives. The parking garage was a tomb of twisted metal and shattered concrete, filled with the skeletal remains of vehicles that would never carry their owners home again. Rusted cars sat at odd angles where they'd been abandoned during the initial chaos, their doors hanging open like screaming mouths frozen in permanent terror. The smell of motor oil and decay hung heavy in the air, mixing with the metallic scent of old blood that stained the concrete floor in dark, irregular patterns. Ronan led them through the maze of abandoned vehicles with the confidence of someone who understood machinery better than people. His calloused hands traced along door frames and bumpers as he assessed each vehicle's potential, muttering under his breath in a mixture of English and Gaelic that spoke to his growing frustration. Most of the cars had been stripped of useful parts long ago, either by other survivors or by Ronan himself during previous scavenging runs. Zephyr leaned heavily against Kestrel as they walked, his breathing becoming more labored with each step. The antibiotics she'd given him seemed to be fighting a losing battle against the infection, and she could feel the heat radiating from his body even through his jacket. She'd seen enough patients in her nursing career to recognize the signs of systemic infection, and the knowledge filled her with a cold dread that had nothing to do with their current surroundings. "There," Ronan said suddenly, pointing toward the far corner of the garage where a massive military transport truck sat shrouded in shadows. "That's our salvation, if I can get her running." The vehicle was a monster of olive drab metal and reinforced tires, built to carry soldiers through hostile territory. Bullet holes pocked its armored sides, and one of the rear windows had been spiderwebbed by some long-ago impact, but the basic structure looked sound. More importantly, it sat high enough off the ground to push through crowds of the undead without getting bogged down. Caspian circled the truck with a professional eye, checking for structural damage and defensive capabilities. "The armor plating is intact, and these windows are thick enough to stop most projectiles. If we can get it running, this thing could punch through anything short of a full military blockade." Indira approached more cautiously, her botanist's eye examining the environment rather than the vehicle itself. "The garage has multiple exit points," she observed, "but there are also multiple ways for the infected to get in. We shouldn't stay here long." As if summoned by her words, a distant crash echoed through the building above them, followed by the unmistakable sound of bodies falling downstairs. The Horde had found their temporary sanctuary and was now searching the building floor by floor, their relentless hunger driving them forward despite any obstacles in their path. Vega tugged on Kestrel's sleeve and pointed toward a dark corner of the garage where several bodies lay crumpled against a concrete pillar. Unlike the fresh dead they'd been encountering, these seemed to have been killed by gunshot wounds rather than infection. Their military fatigues and tactical gear suggested they'd been National Guard, probably part of the unit that had originally brought the transport truck to this location. Poor bastards, Ronan murmured as he began examining the truck's engine compartment. Probably made it through the initial outbreak only to get cornered here when their fuel ran out. Kestrel approached the bodies carefully, her medical training overriding her natural revulsion. They've been dead for months, she confirmed, noting the advanced state of decomposition. Long enough that there's no infection risk. She began searching through their equipment, finding ammunition, medical supplies, and most importantly, a set of keys that matched the truck's ignition. Zephyr had managed to prop himself against the truck's bumper and was connecting his laptop to a diagnostic port hidden beneath the dashboard. Despite his weakening condition, his fingers moved with practiced efficiency across the keyboard. The electronics are intact, he reported. Fuel gauge shows about a quarter tank, which should be enough to get us out of the city if the engine turns over. The sound of their pursuers was getting closer, echoing through the building stairwells and elevator shafts. Ronan worked feverishly to get the engine started, his mechanical expertise the difference between escape and becoming trapped prey. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold air, and his usual cheerful demeanor had been replaced by grim determination. "Come on, you beautiful beast," he whispered to the truck as he made final adjustments to the engine. "Don't fail us now." Caspian had taken position near the garage's main entrance, his weapon ready and his experienced eyes scanning for threats. The military bearing that had been drilled into him during his service was fully engaged now, and Kestrel could see the calculated assessment he was making of their tactical situation. They were in a bottleneck with limited escape routes, exactly the kind of scenario that had claimed countless survivors since the outbreak began. The engine coughed, sputtered, and then roared to life with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the enclosed space. The truck's headlights blazed to life, cutting through the shadows and revealing the true extent of the carnage around them. Blood spatters on the walls told stories of desperate last stands, and the scattered remains of personal belongings spoke to the human cost of this new world. "Everyone in, now!" Caspian shouted as the first shapes appeared at the top of the garage's access ramp. The dead had found them, drawn by the sound of the engine and the scent of living flesh. They stumbled down the concrete slope with the mindless determination that made them so terrifying, their numbers growing with each passing second. Ronan gunned the engine as the others scrambled into the truck's reinforced cabin. The vehicle lurched forward with surprising speed for something so massive, its armored bulk scattering abandoned cars like toys as it headed for the exit. Through the bulletproof windows, Kestrel watched as dozens of infected figures emerged from the building, their reaching hands grasping desperately for the salvation that was pulling away from them. As they burst out of the garage and into the gray afternoon light, Kestrel felt a moment of hope that was immediately tempered by the sight of the road ahead. The street was filled with more of the dead than she'd ever seen in one place, a sea of shuffling bodies that stretched as far as the eye could see. They weren't just escaping a building. They were diving headfirst into the heart of the storm that was consuming their world. The truck plowed through the horde like a ship cutting through dark waves, its reinforced bumper sending bodies flying in grotesque arcs through the gray afternoon air. The sound of impact was nauseating, wet thuds and cracking bones that echoed through the cabin despite the thick armor plating. Kestrel forced herself to look away from the windows as another body slammed against the windshield, leaving a smear of blackened blood before sliding away. Ronan's knuckles were white on the steering wheel as he navigated through the maze of abandoned vehicles and grasping hands that reached for them from every direction. "The fuel gauge is dropping faster than I'd like," he called back over the engine's roar. "Whatever's causing this massive migration, we need to get clear of it before we run dry." Zephyr had managed to connect his laptop to the truck's communication system, his fever-bright eyes scanning through emergency broadcasts and survivor networks. "I'm picking up transmissions from other groups," he reported, his voice growing weaker with each word. "Sounds like this horde stretches for miles. Something big must have happened to drive them all in this direction." Through the rear window, Kestrel could see that their passage through the crowd had created a disturbance that was spreading outward like ripples in a pond. The infected were becoming more agitated, their usual aimless wandering replaced by directed movement toward their truck. Even those they'd knocked down were struggling to their feet, driven by the relentless hunger that defined their existence. Indira sat beside Vega in the back seat, her arms wrapped protectively around the little girl who hadn't spoken since they'd left the garage. The botanist's normally calm demeanor was strained, her dark eyes reflecting the same barely contained panic that Kestrel felt building in her own chest. They were trapped inside a metal box surrounded by thousands of creatures that wanted nothing more than to tear them apart. There, Caspian pointed ahead to where the street branched off toward the residential district. If we can make it to Maple Avenue, we can follow it up into the hills. The road's narrow enough that we won't have to deal with this density of infected. The turn required Ronan to slow down significantly, and immediately the truck was swarmed by grasping hands and gnashing teeth. The infected threw themselves against the armored sides with such force that the entire vehicle rocked back and forth. Some managed to climb onto the hood, their rotting faces pressed against the windshield as they sought any way to reach the living flesh inside. "Get them off!" Vega screamed suddenly, her first words since entering the garage. The sight of decomposing faces inches from her own had finally broken through her traumatized silence, and her terrified cries filled the cabin with raw panic. Caspian reached forward and activated the truck's windshield wipers, which were reinforced with razor wire. The blade swept across the glass with mechanical precision, severing fingers and scraping away the worst of the blood and tissue that obscured their view. The infected on the hood tumbled away, replaced immediately by others who clawed their way up from the street. Almost there, Ronan muttered through gritted teeth as he forced the truck through the turn. The rear wheels spun against the pavement, made slippery by the bodily fluids of their attackers, but the heavy vehicle's momentum carried them forward. Just a few more yards and we'll be. The explosion came from somewhere behind them, a massive detonation that lit up the sky and sent a shockwave rolling through the horde. The infected stopped their assault on the truck and turned toward the source of the disturbance, their primitive brains responding to the new stimulus. In the distance, a pillar of black smoke rose from what looked like the downtown area, and even from miles away, they could see debris falling like deadly rain. "What the hell was that?" Kestrel asked, but no one had an answer. In the sudden silence that followed the blast, they could hear the truck's engine ticking as it cooled, and the distant sound of sirens from whatever emergency services still functioned in their dying city. Zephyr's laptop chimed with an incoming transmission, and his pale fingers struggled to open the connection. The voice that emerged from the speakers was crackling with static but unmistakably human. "This is Colonel Marcus Thorne of the Federal Emergency Response Team. We have initiated a controlled demolition of the downtown contamination zone to redirect infected migration patterns. All survivors in the metropolitan area should evacuate immediately to designated safe zones. Repeat, downtown has been destroyed to contain the spread." The transmission cut to static, leaving them in stunned silence. The government, or what remained of it, had just sacrificed an entire section of their city in an attempt to control the infected. Thousands of people who might have been hiding in those buildings, waiting for rescue, had just been obliterated along with their undead neighbors. "My God," Indira whispered. "They're not trying to save people anymore. They're just trying to contain the damage." Ronan got the truck moving again, following the residential street up into the hills where the density of infected began to thin out. The houses here were larger and set farther apart, their manicured lawns now overgrown with weeds and littered with the detritus of abandoned lives. Children's toys lay scattered in driveways, their bright colors faded by months of weather and neglect. Zephyr suddenly convulsed, his body seizing as the infection reached a critical stage. Kestrel lunged forward to help him, but there was little she could do in the confined space of the moving vehicle. His laptop slipped from his fingers and crashed to the floor, its screen flickering and going dark. "Pull over," she ordered Ronan. "Now." "We can't stop here," Caspian protested. "We're too exposed, and there are still infected in the area." "If we don't stop, he's going to die," Kestrel shot back, her medical training overriding tactical concerns. "And if he dies, we lose our only link to Haven and any other survivor networks." Ronan found a relatively defensible position behind a large house and brought the truck to a stop. Kestrel immediately began working on Zephyr, checking his vital signs and administering what medication she had left. His pulse was rapid and thready, his breathing shallow and labored. The infection had spread throughout his system, and she knew with professional certainty that they were losing him. "Stay with us," she whispered, holding his burning hand in hers. "We need you, Zephyr. Haven needs you." But even as she spoke the words, she could see the light fading from his eyes. The brilliant teenager who had kept them connected to the wider world of survivors was slipping away, taking with him their best hope of reaching safety. In a world where every loss diminished their chances of survival, losing Zephyr felt like watching the future itself die. Zephyr's death came quietly in the pre-dawn darkness, his labored breathing simply stopping between one moment and the next. Kestrel sat beside his still form for long minutes, her hand resting on his chest, waiting for a breath that would never come. The teenager who had mapped their escape routes and maintained their communication with the outside world was gone, leaving behind only a cooling body and a laptop that might as well have been ancient hieroglyphics to most of them. Ronan had kept the truck running through the night, ready to move at the first sign of danger, but the residential area had remained relatively quiet. A few scattered infected wandered between the houses, drawn by some unknowable instinct, but nothing like the massive horde they'd escaped downtown. Still, they all knew they couldn't stay here long. The dead had a way of accumulating wherever the living tried to rest. "We have to take his laptop," Vega said suddenly, her small voice cutting through the heavy silence. Everyone turned to look at the 8-year-old, surprised by her first words since her outburst in the truck. "Zephyr showed me some things before he got sick. Said it was important that someone else knew, just in case." Caspian studied the girl with new interest. Throughout their time together, Vega had been withdrawn and seemingly traumatized into silence by whatever she'd witnessed during the initial outbreak. But now there was a clarity in her dark eyes that spoke to hidden depths. What kind of things? How to find the emergency frequencies. How to read the maps he made. How to charge the battery with the truck's power. Vega wiped her nose with the back of her hand, a gesture that reminded them all how young she was despite the terrible circumstances that had aged her beyond her years. "He said children learn faster because we don't think we already know everything." Indira reached over and squeezed the girl's shoulder gently. "He was very smart to teach you those things." They prepared Zephyr's body as best they could in their circumstances, wrapping him in a sleeping bag and placing him beside a large oak tree in the backyard of an abandoned house. There was no time for a proper burial, but Caspian marked the location on his map and promised they would return someday when the world was safer. It was a promise they all knew he might not be able to keep, but it felt necessary in the moment. Vega took charge of the laptop with surprising competence, her small fingers navigating through Zephyr's files and programs while the adults watched in amazement. "There are messages," she announced after several minutes of concentrated work. "Lots of them. People trying to reach us." The communications were a mix of desperate pleas for help and valuable intelligence about conditions throughout the region. Several groups reported successful evacuations to the mountain settlement called Haven, but the routes they described were increasingly treacherous. Military checkpoints had been abandoned, and some areas that had been clear just days ago were now completely overrun. More disturbing were the reports of other survivors turning hostile, forming raiding parties that attacked weaker groups for supplies and vehicles. The breakdown of civilization hadn't just created the threat of the infected, it had also released humanity's darkest impulses. In a world where resources were scarce and death lurked around every corner, some people had chosen to prey on their own species. "Look at this one," Vega said, pointing to a message that had arrived just hours ago. "It's from someone calling himself Lysander. He says he controls the main road through the mountains and demands tribute from anyone trying to pass." Caspian's expression darkened as he read over the girl's shoulder. "Tribute. That's just another word for robbery with violence. I've seen this before in war zones. When authority breaks down, someone always tries to fill the vacuum with their own power. Ronan studied their remaining fuel gauge and the maps Zephyr had compiled. "We've got maybe 50 miles left in the tank, and Haven is still 30 miles away through mountain roads. If this Lysander character really does control the main route, we'll have to find another way around." Indira had been quietly examining a paper map, tracing alternative routes with her finger. "There's an old logging road that runs parallel to the highway, about 10 miles to the east. It's not marked on most maps, but I used it years ago for fieldwork. It's rough terrain, but it might get us through without encountering these bandits." The decision to attempt the logging road meant abandoning the relative comfort and safety of the truck for a dangerous hike through unfamiliar mountain terrain. They would have to carry everything they needed on their backs, including Vega, who was too small to make the journey on foot. But staying on the main road seemed increasingly impossible, and their fuel situation gave them limited options. They spent the morning preparing for the transition from motorized to foot travel, selecting only the most essential supplies they could carry. Kestrel packed her medical kit and remaining medications, while Ronan filled a bag with basic tools and mechanical supplies. Indira carefully chose seeds and plant samples that might prove valuable for establishing sustainable food sources, and Caspian distributed weapons and ammunition among the group. Vega proved surprisingly capable of managing Zephyr's laptop and a portable battery pack, insisting that maintaining communication with other survivors was crucial for their long-term survival. The weight of the electronics would slow them down, but the intelligence they provided could mean the difference between walking into safety or into an ambush. As they prepared to abandon the truck that had carried them away from the urban nightmare, Kestrel couldn't help but feel they were taking another step backward toward a more primitive existence. Each loss, their temporary shelter, Zephyr's expertise, and now their motorized transport, stripped away another layer of the technological civilization they'd once taken for granted. The logging road Indira had described was barely visible through the undergrowth, little more than twin ruts carved into the hillside by decades of heavy machinery. The forest around them was dense with Douglas fir and cedar, their branches creating a canopy so thick that the afternoon light filtered down in scattered patches. It was beautiful in a way that reminded them of what the world had been before the infection, but it was also dangerous, providing perfect cover for both the infected and hostile survivors. As they shouldered their packs and began the difficult climb into the mountains, Kestrel found herself thinking about Haven and what they might find when they arrived. The name itself suggested hope and safety, but she'd learned not to trust in promises of sanctuary. In this new world, the only thing they could truly depend on was each other. The logging road wound through the mountain forest like a scar across the landscape, steep and treacherous even in the best of conditions. After 2 days of climbing, their small group was exhausted and running dangerously low on water. Kestrel's nursing training had included wilderness medicine, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of treating injuries and illness while constantly moving through hostile terrain with limited supplies. Ronan's mechanical expertise had proven invaluable in unexpected ways, as he'd rigged a makeshift travois from fallen branches to help carry their heaviest supplies and give Vega occasional breaks from walking. The little girl had been remarkably resilient, but Kestrel could see the toll the journey was taking on her small frame. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and she'd grown increasingly quiet as they climbed higher into the mountains. Indira moved through the forest with the confidence of someone who understood the natural world intimately. She'd found edible plants and a small stream that provided clean water, skills that had probably saved their lives more than once. But even her expertise couldn't hide the fact that they were racing against the onset of an early winter. The temperature dropped noticeably each night, and frost had begun forming on their equipment by morning. Vega had maintained sporadic contact with other survivor groups through Zephyr's laptop, charging the battery each night using a small solar panel Ronan had salvaged from an abandoned cabin. The news from the outside world was increasingly grim. Several settlements had gone silent, their final transmissions describing coordinated attacks by organized raider groups. The mountain community of Haven still responded to communications, but their messages had grown more cautious and defensive. "There's something you all need to hear," Vega announced on their third evening in the mountains. She'd been monitoring the radio frequencies while the adults set up camp in a small clearing beside the logging road. I picked up a transmission from that Lysander person. He's not just robbing people anymore, he's building an army. Caspian immediately moved to listen as Vega played back the recorded message. The voice that emerged from the laptop speakers was cultured and articulate, with the kind of commanding presence that had probably served its owner well in the world before the collapse. This is Lysander, speaking to all survivors in the Pacific Northwest. The old world is dead, consumed by chaos and the walking corpses of the weak. But from its ashes, we will build something stronger. Join us, and know the security that comes from strength. Resist us, and face the consequences. Megalomaniac, Caspian muttered. I've seen his type before, charismatic leaders who use crisis to build personal power. The breakdown of civilization always produces them, like vultures gathering around carrion. Indira was examining their map by firelight, trying to estimate how much farther they had to travel. If he really is controlling the main road, then other groups will be forced to use routes like this one. We might not be alone up here. As if summoned by her words, the sound of voices drifted through the forest from somewhere ahead of them on the trail. Caspian immediately motioned for silence and began extinguishing their small campfire, but it was too late. Light from flashlights was already visible through the trees, moving in their direction with the purposeful advance of people who knew exactly where they were going. Pack everything, now, Caspian whispered urgently. Leave anything that's not essential. They moved with the practiced efficiency of people who had learned that hesitation meant death, but the approaching voices were getting closer. Ronan quickly dismantled his travois and distributed its contents among their packs, while Kestrel made sure all their medical supplies were secure. Vega clutched the laptop protectively, her eyes wide with fear but her movements steady and determined. The first figure to emerge from the darkness was a tall woman carrying a military-style rifle, her clothing a mixture of outdoor gear and tactical equipment. Behind her came 3 more people, all armed and moving with the disciplined coordination of an organized group. But what chilled Kestrel to the bone was the symbol painted on their clothing, a stylized wolf's head that marked them as followers of the self-proclaimed leader they'd been hearing about. Well, well, the woman called out in a voice that carried easily through the cold night air. What do we have here? A family camping trip in the middle of the apocalypse? Caspian stepped forward slightly, his hands visible but his posture ready for action. His military bearing was evident even in the darkness, and Kestrel could see the other group assessing him as a potential threat. Just survivors trying to get to safety, he replied calmly. We don't want any trouble. The woman laughed, a sound devoid of warmth or humanity. Trouble? Oh, you've already got trouble, friend. You're in territory claimed by Lysander's pack, and passage requires payment. The question is whether you're going to pay the easy way or the hard way. Behind her, the other raiders spread out to flank their position, their weapons trained on the small group of survivors. Kestrel's heart raced as she realized they were hopelessly outgunned and surrounded. These weren't desperate scavengers looking for supplies, they were organized soldiers serving a leader who had decided that the collapse of civilization was an opportunity rather than a tragedy. What kind of payment? Ronan asked, his Irish accent thick with tension. Everything, the woman replied matter-of-factly. Weapons, supplies, equipment. In return, we let you continue on your way with your lives. It's a generous offer, considering the alternatives. Vega stepped closer to Kestrel, the laptop still clutched in her small hands. The device contained their only link to Haven and the wider network of survivors who were trying to rebuild some semblance of civilization. Losing it would mean more than just the loss of equipment, it would mean the loss of hope itself. And if we refuse? Caspian asked, though they all knew the answer. The woman's smile was visible even in the dim light of the raiders' flashlights. Then you become examples for the next group that thinks they can pass through our territory without paying tribute. Lysander always needs fresh converts, and there's nothing quite like a demonstration of consequence to motivate cooperation. The standoff stretched through long moments while Caspian calculated odds and options. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and caught in the open with nowhere to run. But Kestrel could see in his eyes the same determination that had carried him through military service and into this nightmare world. He was not a man who surrendered easily, even when the situation seemed hopeless. "You've got 30 seconds to decide," the woman continued. "And just so we're clear, the child comes with us either way. Lysander has plans for the young ones, special training to prepare them for the new world we're building." That threat broke something inside Kestrel that she hadn't known existed. The idea of Vega being taken by these predators, trained to become another instrument of their leader's will, was more than she could bear. Around her, she could sense the same protective fury rising in the others. They had lost too much already to surrender the innocent life they'd sworn to protect. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the violence that everyone knew was coming. The first shot came from Indira, the quiet botanist, revealing hidden depths as she drew a concealed pistol and put a bullet center mass into the nearest raider. The man dropped without a sound, his weapon clattering against the rocky ground as chaos erupted in the small clearing. Years of field research in dangerous environments had apparently taught her more than just plant identification. Caspian moved with military precision, using the moment of surprise to dive for cover behind a fallen log while drawing his own weapon. His first shot took down the woman who had been doing the talking, her confident smirk disappearing along with most of her head. The remaining raiders scrambled for positions among the trees, their disciplined formation dissolving into individual survival instincts. "Stay down!" Ronan shouted to Vega as he grabbed the girl and pulled her behind their hastily abandoned packs. His mechanic's hands found a heavy wrench from his tools, and while it wasn't much against firearms, it was better than facing their attackers empty-handed. Kestrel found herself pressed against a tree trunk with bullets splintering bark inches from her head. Her medical training had included trauma care under fire, but the theory was vastly different from the reality of people trying to kill her. The acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with the pine scent of the forest, creating an incongruous combination that would forever remind her of this moment. The firefight was brief but vicious, echoing through the mountains like thunder. When the smoke cleared, 3 of the 4 raiders lay dead among the fallen leaves, their blood soaking into the earth that had witnessed too much violence already. The 4th had vanished into the darkness, wounded but mobile enough to carry word back to their leader about the survivors who had dared to resist. "Is everyone okay?" Caspian called out, his voice steady despite the adrenaline that had to be coursing through his system. Vega emerged from behind the packs with Ronan, the laptop still clutched protectively in her arms. Her eyes were wide with shock, but she seemed physically unharmed. Indira was reloading her pistol with practiced efficiency, her botanist's calm completely at odds with the violence she just participated in. Only Kestrel seemed truly shaken by what had happened, her hands trembling as she checked herself for wounds. "We need to move," Indira said quietly. "The one who got away will bring reinforcements, and this logging road is too exposed for a running battle." Caspian was already examining the weapons and equipment left behind by their attackers. Military-grade firearms, tactical gear, and most importantly, a radio tuned to frequencies used by Lysander's organization. "These aren't random bandits," he confirmed. "This is professional equipment, military discipline. Someone's building a real army up here." The radio crackled to life with an incoming transmission, and they all froze as a familiar voice filled the clearing. "Strike Team 3, report status. Have you encountered the group described in yesterday's intelligence briefing?" Caspian made a quick decision and keyed the microphone, deepening his voice and hoping the radio's distortion would hide his identity. "Team 3 here. No contact yet. Continuing patrol. Acknowledged. Remember, the child is priority capture. Lysander wants all young survivors brought in for evaluation and training. Team 3 out." The transmission ended, leaving them in a silence that felt heavier than the gunfire that had preceded it. The implications were clear: this Lysander wasn't just robbing survivors for supplies. He was systematically capturing children, probably to indoctrinate them into his growing army. Vega's value as a target had just increased exponentially. How did they know about us? Ronan asked, his accent thick with worry. Someone's been feeding them information about survivor movements. Vega looked up from the laptop screen, her young face grave with understanding beyond her years. It was in Zephyr's files, she said quietly. Someone's been monitoring our communications, tracking groups as they try to reach Haven. This Lysander person knows exactly who's traveling where. The betrayal cut deep. The communication networks that had been their lifeline to other survivors had been compromised, turned into hunting tools by someone with the technical knowledge to intercept and decode their transmissions. Every message they'd sent, every plan they'd made, had potentially been shared with their enemies. Indira was studying their map again, this time looking for routes that avoided not just the infected but also the organized human threats that seemed to control larger areas of the mountains. There's an old mining trail about 2 miles east of here. It's steep and dangerous, but it might get us to Haven without using any of the major routes. How dangerous? Kestrel asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. The mine was abandoned in the 1940s after several cave-ins killed most of the crew. The trail follows unstable cliffs and passes through areas where rock slides are common. In good weather, with proper equipment and experienced guides, it would be challenging. In our current situation. She shrugged expressively. Caspian collected the raiders' weapons and ammunition, distributing them among the group despite their limited experience with firearms. We'll take our chances with falling rocks over organized killers, he decided. At least the mountain doesn't actively hunt us. They gathered their reduced supplies and began moving deeper into the forest, away from the logging road and toward terrain that would challenge their survival skills in new and dangerous ways. Behind them, the bodies of their attackers lay cooling in the mountain air, testimony to the violence that had become commonplace in their dying world. As they climbed toward the old mining trail, Kestrel found herself thinking about the children Lysander was apparently collecting. How many young survivors had been captured and forced into service with his army? How many families had been torn apart by raiders claiming to offer protection while actually building an empire on the bones of civilization? The radio they'd taken from the raiders continued to broadcast periodic updates about patrol movements and captured prisoners. Each transmission painted a clearer picture of the scope of Lysander's operation, dozens of teams, hundreds of followers, and a systematic campaign to control territory and resources throughout the mountain region. We have to warn Haven, Vega said as they paused to rest beside a shallow stream. If this Lysander person really does control the main roads, then people trying to reach the settlement are walking into traps. First we have to get there ourselves, Caspian replied, but his expression showed he understood the broader implications. If Haven fell to Lysander's forces, then one of the last beacons of hope in their region would be extinguished. The mountain settlement represented more than just safety, it was proof that civilization could survive and rebuild even in the aftermath of apocalypse. The mining trail, when they finally found it, was everything Indira had warned them it would be. The path was narrow and treacherous, carved into the side of cliffs that dropped away into misty valleys far below. Loose rock shifted under their feet with each step, and the sound of their passage echoed off the stone walls like whispered threats of impending collapse. But it was also beautiful in a stark, unforgiving way that reminded them of the world's enduring power to inspire awe even in the midst of humanity's darkest hour. As they climbed toward an uncertain future, Kestrel allowed herself a moment of hope that they might yet find the sanctuary they sought. The approach to Haven revealed itself gradually through the morning mist, like a vision emerging from the dreams of desperate survivors. The settlement sprawled across a natural plateau surrounded by defensive walls that had been constructed from salvaged vehicles and shipping containers, their metal surfaces painted in earth tones that helped them blend with the mountainous terrain. Guard towers rose at regular intervals, and the glint of solar panels on rooftops spoke to a community that had managed to maintain some technological capability despite the collapse of the wider world. But it was the gardens that took Kestrel's breath away. Terraced plots descended the hillside in carefully planned rows, filled with vegetables and grains that represented hope made tangible. After months of scavenging and rationing, the sight of actual cultivation was almost overwhelming. Indira stopped walking entirely, her botanist's eyes drinking in the evidence that sustainable agriculture was still possible. "They've done it," she whispered. "They've actually created a functioning ecosystem." The guards who met them at Haven's gates were professional but cautious, their weapons ready but not threatening as they verified the small group's identity against a list of expected arrivals. The communication networks that had been compromised by Lysander apparently hadn't prevented word of their journey from reaching the settlement. They were expected, though the guards seemed surprised that only 4 of them had survived the mountain crossing. "Dr. Kestrel Martinez?" The head guard consulted his clipboard with the bureaucratic precision that somehow survived even in post-apocalyptic settlements. "We've been expecting you since the emergency transmission 3 days ago. Follow me, please. The council wants to debrief you immediately." The interior of Haven exceeded even their cautious hopes. Streets were clean and well-maintained, with hand-painted signs directing visitors to essential services like medical care, education, and food distribution. Children played in small parks under the watchful eyes of adults who carried weapons but wore expressions of determined normalcy. It was civilization in miniature, fragile but functioning. Vega stayed close to Kestrel as they walked through the settlement, her young eyes taking in everything with the intensity of someone memorizing paradise. The laptop remained clutched in her arms, its intelligence about survivor networks and raider activities potentially valuable to Haven's defensive planning. She'd proven herself remarkably capable during their journey, but Kestrel could see the emotional toll reflected in the girl's too serious expression. The council meeting was held in what had once been the community center of a small mountain town that formed Haven's core. 5 people sat around a table covered with maps and radio equipment, their faces showing the weight of leadership during humanity's darkest hour. They listened intently as Caspian provided a military briefing on Lysander's organization, taking careful notes about raider tactics and communication frequencies. "The situation is worse than we thought," admitted Dr. Sarah Chen, Haven's medical director and apparent head of the council. "We've lost contact with 4 other settlements in the past month, and refugee reports suggest systematic attacks on organized communities. This Lysander appears to be consolidating power throughout the region." Ronan shared the technical intelligence he'd gathered about the raiders' equipment and coordination, while Indira provided detailed information about the terrain they traversed and potential defensive positions. Each piece of information added to a growing picture of a coordinated campaign to dominate the scattered survivors of the Pacific Northwest. "We need to warn other settlements," Vega said suddenly, her child's voice cutting through the adult discussion. Zephyr's network included groups all over the country. "If we can get word out, maybe people can prepare." Dr. Chen studied the little girl with interest. "You're the one who's been maintaining the communication network since your friend's death. That's impressive technical knowledge for someone your age." "Zephyr said children learn faster because we don't think we already know everything," Vega replied, unconsciously echoing words that had become a kind of mantra during their journey. "He taught me because he knew someone had to carry on if something happened to him." The council session continued for hours, with detailed planning for improved defensive measures and expanded communication with other survivor communities. Haven's resources were significant but not unlimited, and the threat posed by an organized army of raiders would require careful strategic thinking to counter effectively. That evening, as their small group was assigned quarters in a converted school building, Kestrel found herself standing on the settlement's outer wall, looking out over the valley they'd climbed through to reach safety. Somewhere down there, Lysander's forces were consolidating power and planning their next moves. The war for the future of humanity was far from over. Caspian joined her at the wall, his military bearing unchanged but his expression showing the relief of a soldier who'd successfully completed a difficult mission. "You know we can't stay here," he said quietly. "Eventually, we'll have to go back down there and fight for the others who can't reach places like this on their own." "I know," Kestrel replied. "But for now, we're safe. Vega's safe. And sometimes, that has to be enough." Indira appeared beside them, carrying a small pot containing seedlings she'd started from specimens collected during their journey. These are heritage varieties, she explained. Plants that haven't been modified for industrial agriculture. If we're really going to rebuild, we'll need genetic diversity that can adapt to changing conditions. Ronan was the last to join them, his mechanical expertise already being put to use maintaining Haven's power generation systems. They've offered me a permanent position, he said. Someone needs to keep the machinery running, and apparently, I'm qualified. As they stood together on the wall, watching the sun set over a landscape that had been forever changed by humanity's near extinction, Kestrel felt the complex mixture of emotions that came with survival. Grief for those they'd lost, relief at reaching safety, and a growing determination to ensure that what they'd built here would endure. Vega emerged from the school building carrying Zephyr's laptop, its screen glowing with incoming messages from survivor groups across the continent. Dr. Chen says I can help coordinate communications between settlements, she announced with the pride of someone who'd found their purpose. We're going to build a real network this time, one that can't be compromised. The little girl who had been traumatized into silence by the apocalypse had found her voice again, and with it, the future had gained another guardian. As night fell over Haven, Kestrel allowed herself to believe that humanity might yet survive its greatest test. The war against extinction would continue, but for the first time in months, they were no longer fighting alone. In the distance, a wolf howled, not one of Lysander's symbols, but a real animal reclaiming territory that humans had temporarily abandoned. It was a sound that spoke to the world's resilience, its ability to heal and renew itself even after the worst disasters. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult decisions, but tonight, they were safe, and that was enough to build hope upon. The apocalypse had taken almost everything from them, but it hadn't taken their humanity. And as long as places like Haven existed, as long as people like Vega carried forward the knowledge and connections that bound survivors together, the future remained possible. Different than before, scarred by unimaginable loss, but still possible.